Hi. So what we're going to do today, we're going to talk about the least common denominator. Before we move into this lesson, I need to make a note. If you have not seen the video or the recording of the least common multiples, please go back and review it because that lesson is crucial to understand this lesson. Okay, they do play a very connected role. So the least common denominator talks about the smallest number that you can use in the denominator to create a set of equivalent fractions that all have the same denominator. It's going to use the same principles that we talked about with the least common multiple. Remember, the bottom line for adding and subtracting or combining fractions using addition and subtraction is to have the same bottom numbers. We cannot add or subtract any fraction without a common denominator. As I mentioned, we have to review the least common multiple lesson first, so if you have not done so, please go back and watch that video or review the lessons because, like I said, you will be completely lost in this lesson if you don't understand the least common multiple. All right? So finding the least common denominator. Well, on this one, we're not going to add subtract fractions yet. We're just going to find the LCD and rewrite fractions. That's about as far as we're going to take it on this one. So we're going to find the least common denominator between 1/2 and 1/3. Now the process we're going to use is we're going to list the times tables for each denominator. Doesn't that sound a little bit familiar? The LCD is going to be the first number that both of those lists have in common. Man, that sounds oddly familiar too. The next step is that we're going to rewrite our fractions using that common denominator. So the first two steps should be very familiar to you. We did that in the least common multiple section. Excuse me. The new part is that we're going to rewrite our fractions using that common denominator. So between 1/2 and 1/3, okay, we're going to list the times tables for each denominator. So we're going to list the times tables for 2 and 3. So 2 times 1 is 2, 2 times 2 is 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, so on and so forth. For 3, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21, 24, 27, this, that, and the third. Okay? If we compare both lists, the smallest number that both of those lists would have in common is 6. So therefore, we're going to use 6 as our least common denominator. Previously, 6 would be considered our least common multiple. Okay? Same principle, just different application. Now, we listed the times table for each denominator. We found the least common denominator. Now, this step, we're going to rewrite our fractions using that common denominator. Okay? So we're going to rewrite both of our fractions with a denominator of 6. Okay? So our first fraction was 1/2. Our second fraction was 1/3. And we need to rewrite both of these fractions as something over 6. Something over 6. Okay? We got to figure out what that something is. So in order for us to do this, okay, we got to be very careful with it. Looking at the first set right here, what times 2 will get us 6? Okay? Let's think about that. I can also explain it a different way. 2 times what gets me 6? All right. Now for this one over here, 3 times what gets me 6? Okay. So on this next step, we have to figure out 2 times what gets me 6, and then 3 times what gets me 6. Okay. So that's what this next step is right here. We're trying to figure out what we have to multiply the denominators by to get to our LCD. All right. So if you think about it, 2 times what gets me 6? Well, that should be 2 times 3 gets me 6. Okay. So far, so good. 2 times 3 gets me 6. Right here. And then over here, 3 times 2 gets me 6. For that one right there, all right? Now, since we multiplied the bottom numbers by 3 and 2, respectively, we've got to multiply the top numbers by 3 and 2 respectively. All right, a little too far. So 2 times 3 gets me 6. Now 1 times 3, well, that should give me a 3 for my question mark right here. And over here, 3 times 2 gets me 6. So 1 times 2 should get me a 2 for that question mark right there. All right. So 1 times 3 is 3. 2 times 3 is 6. For this one, 3 times 2 is 6. 1 times 2 is 2. So therefore, we can say that 1/2 can be rewritten as 3 over 6, and 1/3 can be rewritten as 2 over 6. Now the next step after this would be adding and subtracting. Okay? We're not going to do it in this lesson right here because that's going to be saved for another lesson. All right? But in order to add or subtract them, you have to have the same denominators. So that's why we have to have it as something over 6 for both fractions. All right? It's a little bit trickier, but I have another example waiting for you, okay? Now this one's a little bit more uppity, but it's still going to be using the same process. So find the least common denominator between 4 and 3 and 5 and 7. We're going to take it a step further, and we're going to rewrite our fractions using that same common denominator. All right? So same process. We list the times tables for each denominator, so we're going to list the times tables for 3 and 7. And then we're going to rewrite it using the same process as above. 4 over 3 as some denominator and 5 over 7 as some denominator. Okay? All right, let's go through this. The first denominator was 3, the second one was 7. So if we do the times tables for 3, then we have 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, so on and so forth. With 7, you have 7, 14, 21, 28, 35, 42, keep on going. All right. So to compare both of those lists, the smallest number that both of those lists would have in common is 21. So therefore, 21 is going to be our least common denominator. So we have to rewrite our first fraction, 4 over 3, as something over 21, and 5 over 7, our second fraction, as something over 21. So if we do the same process, 3 times what will give me 21? Well, it should be 7. 7 times what will give me 21? Should be a 3. Okay, so that's what this next step talks about. 3 times what gets me 21? So it should be 3 times 7 gets me 21. For this second fraction over here, 7 times what gets me 21? That should be 7 times 3, which is this next step right here. So we have 3 times 7, which gives me 21. So now the next step should be 4 times 7 should give me this question mark right here. So 4 times 7, that should give us a 28 for our next step. See, 28 right here. And then over here, for the second fraction, 7 times 3 gets us 21. So now 5 times 3, well, that should be a 15 in our question mark. Okay? So, like I said, 3 times 7 gets you 21. 4 times 7 gets you 28. 7 times 3 gets us 21. 5 times 7 gets us a 15. See, there we go. 4 times 7 is 28. 5 times 3 is 15. So if you wanted to add them, just to take it a step further, you would keep the same denominator and just add your numerators. So 28 plus 15, well, that should give you a 43 over 21. All right. So, like I said, that's going to be for our next lesson. But in order to do any kind of addition or subtraction on 4/3 and 5/7, you have to rewrite them using the same denominators. And this is the process we can go about finding the LCD. Okay? Now, like I said, it is a little trickier, but this is the processes that we can use to find the LCD. Okay, we have to use the processes for the least common multiple in order to find the least common denominator. All right. So, as I said before, the least common denominator is crucial for anything dealing with fractions, specifically adding and subtracting fractions. Because fractions cannot be operated on without the same denominator, specifically adding and subtracting, this process is needed in order to combine any kind of measurements of objects, for example, in carpentry, construction, or even baking for that matter. Ironically, we use carpentry and construction and baking every single day. Your husbands or spouses probably do construction or carpentry in their sheds. I do it all the time. Baking, we have to measure out. You have to measure out certain amounts of flour, certain amounts of chocolate chips, things like that. So yeah, fractions and adding and subtracting is very, very important when it comes to everyday life. Okay, and in order to add or subtract them, we got to find the least common denominator. All right, so the LCD is always a very tricky one for students, and I completely understand. So definitely do not hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions about it, because we're going to do a lot of applications and a lot of fractions, because that's what a lot of students struggle with, and you know the old saying, practice does make perfect. All right, so like I said, reach out to me if you guys have any questions of any kind. I'm happy to help. Until next time, don't have too much fun, okay?